Baruch Spinoza ranks among those thinkers who are particularly difficult to approach for the fundamental reason that his philosophy claims to constitute a system encompassing the totality of things. In other words, Spinoza's project consists in nothing less than giving us an account of God or nature, two realities that he considers identical. God or nature, that is to say, the entirety of everything that exists. And you can easily understand that attempting to embrace such a totality within an online video represents a considerable challenge. So we shall attempt the exercise while asking in advance for your indulgence. To circumvent this difficulty, this video aims to serve as a gateway into Spinoza's thought, rather than a complete overview of his philosophy. Let us begin with a few biographical landmarks, because, as you will soon realize, Spinoza was an extraordinary figure. A 17th century philosopher, a Jew of Portuguese origin who had taken refuge in the Netherlands, he became deeply controversial because of his religious positions. His community excommunicated him, and he even survived an assassination attempt. In this regard, it is worth noting that his attacker tried to stab him, and Spinoza kept the cloak pierced by the blade until his final days. His masterpiece, Ethics, was published in 1677, 2 years after his death, because he knew perfectly well that publishing such a work during his lifetime would have condemned him to the stake. Spinoza belonged to that rare kind of philosopher who cuts straight to the heart of things without indulgence or precaution. Let us now examine concretely why his philosophical positions were, for the time, radically new, even subversive. But first, we must establish the intellectual context. Spinoza is generally presented as the great opponent of René Descartes, his contemporary. An opponent, though with certain reservations, since he did not reject the entirety of Cartesian thought. However, he opposed Descartes on one crucial point. Whereas Descartes was a dualist, that is, convinced of a clear separation between matter and mind, between extension and thought, Spinoza believed that such a division was artificial. In doing so, he anticipated what would later be called monism, namely the conviction that it is impossible to separate body and soul. Since Plato, this ontological divide between body and mind has been regarded as self-evident, an assumption that aligned perfectly with the Christian worldview, which distinguished between a material earthly realm and a spiritual afterlife. But for Baruch Spinoza, this boundary is unfounded. In reality, body and mind are, according to him, merely two attributes of one and the same substance, which he calls God, or nature. To make this monist idea more accessible, I will rely on a few concrete illustrations. Let us take cannabis as an example. For those familiar with it, this substance alters mental capacities and changes what we call the state of consciousness. In other words, under its influence, one thinks differently and perceives things differently. But at the same time, cannabis also impairs physical abilities. Try boxing or lifting weights after consuming it. You will notice that the effort becomes remarkably difficult. From this example, we can clearly understand that a psychological alteration necessarily brings about a physical alteration, and that these two dimensions, spiritual and bodily, are profoundly interconnected. They cannot be separated as though they functioned independently. Under the effects of cannabis, one becomes sluggish, and this sluggishness does not distinguish between mind and body. It invades both indiscriminately. This is what led certain commentators to describe Spinoza's thought as a form of parallelism, a parallelism of body and soul, of extension and thought. We will return to this body-mind distinction in a future video, but as I mentioned, Spinoza's philosophy is a philosophy of totality, and for this first introduction, I would rather not confront it head-on. I wish to approach it from another angle. Most philosophers offer multiple points of entry into their thought, but with Spinoza, these entry points are rare and narrow. Nevertheless, I have identified one for this video. As I was saying, Spinoza rejects Cartesian dualism, this separation between soul and body inherited from Plato. Yet this monist vision has a very concrete consequence. It determines Spinoza's conception of freedom. For him, freedom is nothing but an illusion. Before explaining why Spinoza considers freedom illusory, it is important to clarify why, for René Descartes, it constitutes a fundamental postulate. According to Descartes, human beings possess free will, that is, the faculty of choice. This free will is what he calls the decree of the soul, the capacity of our will to determine itself without being conditioned by external influences. Free will is the autonomy of the will in relation to matter, and this autonomy is inseparable from the body-mind duality, because freedom presupposes that the mind can determine itself independently of the body. This is precisely how Spinoza's monism directly undermines the notion of free will. Why would free will be an illusion? Because human beings, being at once physical and spiritual beings, that is to say, conscious beings, imagine themselves to be the authors of their own actions, the sovereign decision-makers of the way they act. In fact, our contemporary societies are built upon this conviction. We believe ourselves to be masters of our behavior, and from this belief arises the notion of responsibility. Without free will, responsibility vanishes, and with it, the very foundation of justice in the legal sense. A murderer could then argue that his body acted mechanically, that his will merely followed along, and that he therefore cannot be held guilty. If free will is a fiction, then everything becomes justifiable, and this is something absolutely revolutionary in the strictest sense of the term, something capable of shaking the very pillars of our collective organization. Imagine that the person who betrayed you, hurt you, or lied to you could hide behind Spinozist monism by declaring, "After all, I do not control my actions. I am entirely conditioned, and therefore I cannot be held responsible for the harm I caused you." Spinoza's vision is therefore inapplicable on the juridical and political level, yet it nevertheless points towards something essential. In the end, are we truly the authors of what we do? Are we really responsible for our thoughts and actions? I say thoughts and actions because, as I have already pointed out, Spinoza establishes no fundamental distinction between the mental sphere and the material sphere. He has this famous formula: the order and connection of ideas are the same as the order and connection of things. In other words, our actions are merely the mechanical translation of our ideas, just as our ideas are merely the mechanical translation of our actions. This way of seeing things is profoundly unsettling, because we systematically tend to establish a hierarchy between thought and action, either believing that action flows from thought or that thought is shaped by our actions. For Spinoza, this is a misunderstanding. It amounts to ignoring the real functioning of the human being and the true nature of the interaction between body and mind. Indeed, we very often observe that changes in our material conditions transform our opinions, and conversely, that the evolution of our convictions influences the way we act, and therefore our concrete existence. The conception defended by René Descartes, that the human being is guided by free will, is in reality a Christian conception, one already found in Augustine of Hippo. Augustine claimed that God had granted free will to mankind, thereby absolving God of any responsibility for the existence of evil in the world. It is because man chooses freely that he can choose either good or evil. And this is what led Descartes to assert that the human being is the only creature in the world endowed with this free will, since inanimate objects are by definition devoid of a soul, and therefore of will, and therefore of freedom.
If I pick up the pen lying in front of me and throw it across the room, the pen has no control over its trajectory. Its movement will simply be the mechanical result of the direction and force I imparted to it. The pen does not choose. Likewise, for Descartes, animals are devoid of free will. This is where his theory of the animal machine originates. When Descartes described animals as machines, he obviously did not mean to reduce them to assemblages of metal or gears. He simply meant that animals obey instinct, a mechanism in which the will plays absolutely no role, precisely because the animal is not conscious of what drives it. Human beings would therefore be the only creatures to possess free will, because they are conscious of what animates them, of their desires. Animals are machines because they act mechanically, without consciousness, and therefore without will. Man, on the other hand, is driven by a consciousness that prevents him from being reduced to an inert object or to a beast, that is, reduced solely to his physical and material dimension. And to a certain extent, this is true. Human beings are not forced to submit to external pressures or to be swept away by every impulse they receive. They can say no. But for Baruch Spinoza, this is not enough, because human free will is above all an illusion born from the fact that human beings are ignorant of the true origin of their desires and thoughts. A person knows that they can decide, but they ignore the chain of causes and effects that led them to make a particular decision at a particular moment under particular circumstances. Once again, an example is useful. Suppose you are peacefully sitting on your couch watching a movie, and suddenly you feel the urge to get a yogurt from the refrigerator. You stand up, take it, and enjoy it with satisfaction, congratulating yourself on being a free human being capable of indulging your desires whenever you wish. And Spinoza would reply that at that moment you forget that a certain number of reasons, a certain number of factors pushed you toward that refrigerator. All of those reasons escape your awareness, and yet they are very real. What Spinoza means is that while we may have the ability to choose, we do not have the ability to choose the reasons that make us choose. Our choice is merely superficial. It rests on the simple recognition of a desire, an affection, in other words, an urge, an emotion, a passion. And these passions are not things we select. We do not choose our passions. We do not choose our desires. We undergo them, just as the pen undergoes the impulse I impose upon it, sending it in a given direction without any possibility of resistance. From this perspective, for Spinoza, we are captives of what he calls determinism. Determinism is the conviction that in a physical universe, everything obeys the law of causality. Every cause produces an effect, which in turn becomes the cause of another effect, and so on infinitely. Why do you crave a yogurt? Perhaps because an advertisement for that product appeared a few minutes earlier during the movie, insinuating itself into your body and mind at a subconscious level in order to plant that desire. This is only one example, but the illustrations would be endless. Take the case of a high school student who, after graduating, chose to pursue biology. On the surface, it appears to be a free choice. They could have just as easily enrolled in law school or business school. But what shaped that choice? Perhaps the fact that they grew up in a family of scientists who transmitted to them a love of science and an interest in living things, so that, without even realizing it, they naturally gravitated towards biology, while remaining deeply convinced that it was entirely their own decision. And subjectively, this is true. Experienced from the inside, this choice does not feel at all like a constraint or an external determination. It is perceived as the expression of complete and genuine freedom. And yet it has causes. It is the product of a chain of causes and effects that led the person there. Nothing we do in our existence escapes this law of causality. For the human being is a physical being, a material being, and as such is subject to the laws governing matter, laws from which one cannot escape or free himself. As a physical being, man is subject to physical laws.
If you decide to leap from the top of your balcony in an attempt to fly, the laws of physics will harshly bring you back to reality. You do not have that freedom, because freedom is always exercised within a framework of physical constraints. It would be like trying to make pancakes without flour or eggs. Absurd. To make pancakes, you follow a recipe, and if you fail to respect its steps, you will produce nothing. Every achievement in the material world requires obedience to a set of rules. This seems obvious to us, and yet it is not so obvious, because in daily life we very often act while ignoring the fundamental laws of matter. Take a row of dominoes collapsing in sequence. When the first one is pushed over, the fall of the last is nothing more than the logical and mechanical consequence of that initial impulse. And yet, in most of our behavior, we fail to connect our actions to their final repercussions because we see only the immediate effects, much like a fly repeatedly throwing itself against a window pane without noticing that the window beside it is wide open. We are trapped in this mental and intellectual blindness that prevents us from perceiving the causal chain within which we exist. And it is precisely this blindness to causality that leads Baruch Spinoza to claim that free will is an illusion. To illustrate this, he uses a remarkably clear metaphor, that of a stone thrown to the ground. If you throw a stone, its trajectory is dictated by the angle and force of the throw. But imagine that at the very moment you release it, the stone suddenly awakens to consciousness. What would it think? It would believe that it is self the cause of its movement, that it alone decides its destination. It would never imagine that its trajectory had been imposed upon it from the outside. According to Spinoza, we are in exactly the same situation as that stone. We are subjected to forces originating elsewhere, yet we delight in believing ourselves to be the source of our movements. For Spinoza, free will is an illusion so long as we believe ourselves to be the cause of our actions and of our thoughts, these two realities being inseparable in his philosophy. The question that naturally arises then is this: what conclusion should we draw from all this? That human beings are ultimately no more elevated than a stone or an animal? That we are just as conditioned by external forces and have no control over anything? That we are prisoners of an immense illusion, of an immense pride that makes us believe in our freedom, freedom of action, freedom of thought, when in reality it is all smoke and mirrors? Not entirely. And this is where an over-hasty reading of Spinoza on freedom and determinism must be corrected. It is convenient to invoke Spinoza in order to argue that human beings are no more free than a stone thrown or an animal following its instincts. It is convenient to proclaim that the idea of freedom is nothing more than a philosophical mirage resting solely on our ignorance of the causes that condition us. Very well, but one must then carry the argument through to its conclusion and understand what Spinoza was truly trying to teach us, which requires reading the Ethics to its very end. I should point out here that, as Gilles Deleuze emphasized, if Spinoza's work is entitled Ethics, it is because it presupposes that human beings possess a power of choice, since ethics only applies to beings capable of exercising mastery over themselves. Deleuze noted that if Spinoza's work merely consisted in describing the illusion of free will and the chain of causes and effects, then the word ethics would be completely inappropriate.
Spinoza should have spoken of ontology, that is, the science of being, the study of what is. But Spinoza speaks of ethics, which means a reflection directed towards action. Ethics is thought oriented towards action. And if human beings were incapable of determining their actions, there would simply be no sense in speaking of ethics at all. In other words, for Spinoza, freedom remains possible. Freedom is real. The question then is how to attain it, and Spinoza himself provides the answer. He explains that human beings, because they are endowed with consciousness, are capable of becoming aware of what determines them, of recognizing that they are subject to influences shaping their choices and behaviors. This faculty of awareness, which he calls reason, is what makes all the difference, because it is through reason that human beings attain freedom. Reason, for Spinoza, is not merely the ability to observe that we are determined. Above all, it is the capacity to understand that we are determined, but determined by what? By forces acting upon us, and more specifically, upon our passions, upon what Spinoza calls our affects, which today we would describe as emotions. Our emotions, as I discussed in my video on Stoicism, are not strictly speaking under our control. They arise, they affect us, we endure them. This is where the Greek term pathos comes from to designate the passions of the soul. In other words, what our soul undergoes. Let us take a few examples. Anxiety, that is, the absence of tranquility. Anxiety is a passion, an affect, something we undergo when we are gripped by uncertainty tinged with fear. Your partner was supposed to be home at 6 p.m. and now it is almost 7. Perhaps they simply decided to stop by a cafe to enjoy a pleasant moment with friends or family. But if you try to call them and they do not answer, anxiety may suddenly arise. And what does this anxiety reveal? Nothing other than your ignorance of the situation, and that ignorance generates fear within you. The fear that something bad may have happened to them, that they may have encountered danger, or that they may be enjoying themselves in the company of someone else.
But is this fear rational? No, it is not, insofar as it contributes nothing to clarifying the situation. It merely adds suffering to uncertainty without resolving anything. Here you can recognize an echo of Stoicism in Baruch Spinoza, and indeed there is one, because we find the same idea that passion enslaves us while reason liberates us. If you remain within reason when anxiety overwhelms you, it will gradually dissolve and disappear, because passion melts away under the power of reason. Why are some people able to pass calmly through situations that would plunge us into anguish? Simply because reason is at work within them, that is to say, consciousness, the awareness that their feelings have no power over the situation and can change nothing about it. And it is when one admits that passion does not alter the course of things that one enters into reason. Reason reminds us that we only have power over what truly belongs to us. And if you apply this same framework to every situation in which emotion takes over, you will realize that reason possesses an almost magical virtue. It has the power to dissolve emotion, to make pathos disappear, to put an end to suffering. And it is at that moment, Spinoza tells us, that you will know joy, not an emotion, but a way of being, consisting in the rational understanding of what is. For once you are inhabited by joy, in other words by reason, that reason which dissolves every passion and every affection, then everything you will do as a free human being. I know this resists conceptualization because it belongs above all to lived experience, but to act in joy is to act with the awareness that what exists cannot be otherwise than it is, and within this acceptance something truly extraordinary appears, the intense joy of existence, the profound joy of what is, and the full consciousness of our power to act, to think, to be. Freedom exists in Spinoza,
because it is not a power of indetermination, not the capacity to tear oneself away from physical conditioning. It is the power to understand that everything is conditioned, and that through this understanding it becomes possible to grasp everything. To act while understanding all that exists is to act freely. This is a fundamental point. For Spinoza, freedom is inseparable from reason, that is, from the power to understand what is. You are not free to declare that 2 + 2 = 5. You are constrained by reality. You must accept it. But is this acceptance painful? Does it constitute a sacrifice? Does it cost you anything? No, it costs you nothing, because it does not diminish what you are. It does not wound your pride or your self-esteem, nor does it offend your passions or affections. So admit that accepting that 2 + 2 = 4 grants you more freedom than stubbornly insisting that it equals 5, for such a belief will sooner or later create concrete problems for you. You are not free to invalidate the Pythagorean theorem, nor are you free to suspend the law of gravity. You work with them, you accept them. Just as you accept the idea of death, you acknowledge that one day you will die, that it is inscribed within the order of things, within the order and connection of things. And yet it is an idea you may refuse. But what is it that refuses it? The ego, pride, fear, passions. Reason consists in accepting death, not in desiring or hastening it, but in welcoming it as a rational fact of physical reality. And if you truly integrate this idea, if you assimilate it so deeply that it no longer generates fear within you, then you will no longer be enslaved by the fear of dying, nor by everything that flows from it. Reason is liberating. It frees you from your fears, your passions, from everything that drives you to reject reality. For we excel at rejecting what is. We excel at finding culprits or people to blame for our own inability to accept things as they are. To be Spinozist, like being Stoic, is not to be fatalistic, nor to surrender or resign. It is to understand that what exists has reasons for existing, causes for existing, and that one cannot oppose causes, nor the forces governing the physical world. One can, however, understand them, and to understand, which etymologically means to hold together within oneself, is to accept, to integrate. When we understand something, we become lighter, we move closer to freedom. The free human being is the one who, through the exercise of reason, is no longer held hostage by passions. A person is free when they act according to reason, because by deciphering the chain of causes and effects, they can free themselves from their passions, extracting themselves from what the laws of matter impose upon them. For if you were nothing but a physical being, the slightest external event could provoke within you a passion you did not choose. The pen cannot resist the trajectory I impose upon it. But you, who are listening to me, possess the ability to not let yourself be invaded by passions coming from the outside, not to let yourself be overwhelmed by the emotions linked to what happens to you, not to be enslaved by your passions. You possess a power, the power of reason, and it is entirely up to you to use it. Thank you.